Jamal Carter, a determined and intelligent 16-year-old, stood in the crowded courtroom, his heart pounding as Judge Holt delivered a life sentence to his brother, Darius, for a crime he didn't commit. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, Jamal refused to let this be the end. He had spent years studying the law, memorizing every statute and case he could find in the library, and now it was time for him to put that knowledge to use. This was no ordinary teenage rebellion. This was a war against a deeply flawed justice system, a system that had failed his brother, a system that saw his skin color as a sentence before a trial had even begun. Judge Holt, an imposing figure, had mocked Jamal throughout the trial, dismissing him as a young boy who knew nothing about the law. But what the judge didn't know was that Jamal had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had been forced to grow up quickly in a world that had always made him feel lesser, but now he was armed with knowledge and a fierce sense of justice. As the gavel slammed down and the judge's booming laugh echoed through the courtroom, Jamal knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of his fight. Back at home, Jamal began drafting an appeal, pulling together all the evidence he could find. The paperwork from Darius's case was a mess, but Jamal's photographic memory cut through the chaos. He found discrepancies in the arrest report, inconsistencies in witness testimony, and a crucial piece of new evidence, a grainy photo from Darius's phone that showed him at a barbershop 3 miles away from the robbery when it occurred. This was the break Jamal had been waiting for. He quickly filed an appeal, citing ineffective counsel, procedural errors, and new evidence that could prove Darius's innocence. But even as he took these first steps, Jamal knew the road ahead would not be easy. The courthouse clerk, Doris, rejected his filing, sneering at his appearance and dismissing him as nothing more than a boy trying to play lawyer. Despite the humiliation, Jamal refused to back down. He knew his rights, and he demanded that his appeal be accepted. With every step, every challenge, Jamal's resolve grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for Darius, he was fighting for every black person who had been wronged by a system designed to keep them down. The battle escalated quickly. Judge Holt called an emergency hearing after hearing about the appeal. Jamal was faced with an even more hostile environment in the courtroom, but he stood tall, clutching his notes and his conviction. Holt mocked him mercilessly, but Jamal pressed on, pointing out a procedural error in the trial's closing arguments that could potentially void the verdict. For the first time, Jamal saw a flicker of uncertainty in Holt's eyes. In the days that followed, Jamal continued to face not only the systemic corruption of the courts, but also threats from those who would do anything to protect their power. Despite these relentless obstacles, Jamal remained undeterred, knowing that the fight for justice was never easy, but always necessary. Every setback, every insult, only fueled his determination. He had cracked the wall of corruption, and he would keep pushing until the truth came to light. This was more than a fight for his brother's freedom. It was a fight for the future, for a world where justice truly meant justice, regardless of race or background. Jamal Carter's journey was only beginning, but it was one he knew he had to finish. Jamal Carter's journey was one of perseverance, grit, and defiance against a system rigged to crush him. His brother Darius had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The judge, Raymond Holt, an embodiment of the biased, corrupt system that had been in place for years, sentenced Darius to life in prison without a second thought. The all-white jury had snickered, dismissing Jamal and his brother like they were nothing more than a statistic. The trial had been an unjust spectacle, the gavel slamming down on Darius's life while Jamal, a 16-year-old teenager, was left in the rubble of a broken justice system. But Jamal refused to let this be the end. It was in the courthouse, with the laugh of Judge Holt echoing in his ears, that he realized the depth of the fight he was up against. While everyone around him expected him to accept the defeat, Jamal was already preparing for war. With the weight of his brother's wrongful conviction pushing him forward, Jamal's resolve solidified. He had spent countless hours memorizing legal codes, reading law books that most people his age would never even glance at. While other teens were chasing footballs or hanging out with friends, Jamal had buried himself in books, knowing that one day he would need this knowledge to fight for justice. Now that day had come. Jamal's first step was to draft an appeal for his brother's case, armed with the legal knowledge he had painstakingly Accumulated, Jamal dove into the messy case files he had secretly swiped from the public defender's office. The files were a jumbled mess, coffee-stained and dog-eared, but Jamal's photographic memory cut through the chaos. He found the key to his brother's freedom, a timestamp error in the robbery case and new evidence in the form of a grainy photograph from Darius's phone showing him at a barbershop at the time of the robbery. This wasn't just a technical error, it was the evidence that could turn the case around. But Jamal knew filing an appeal wouldn't be easy. The courthouse clerk, Doris, made it abundantly clear that she wasn't about to accept the appeal from a kid like Jamal. Her condescending remarks, along with the sneer of her colleague Travis, only strengthened Jamal's resolve. He wasn't just filing an appeal, he was filing a protest against the system that had tried to bury his brother. Doris refused to accept his appeal, shoving it back at him, telling him to get a real lawyer or leave. But Jamal stood his ground. He wasn't going to let anyone, not Doris nor the system, invalidate his right to fight for his brother. Jamal's legal fight had just begun, but the reality of the situation soon became clear. Judge Holt, the man who had sentenced Darius to life, called for an emergency hearing after hearing about the appeal. This wasn't a simple case of court procedure. It was a battle against the system, one that had been rigged for years to ensure that people like Jamal never stood a chance. The courtroom was filled with reporters, all eyes on Jamal as he stepped forward to speak. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The judge, with his mocking demeanor and oppressive presence, wasn't going to make things easy. Jamal stood before Judge Holt, his heart pounding in his chest but his mind clear and focused. He was no longer just a teenager fighting for his brother. He was a warrior fighting against a corrupt system that had crushed countless lives before his. Holt, sitting there in his judge's robe, sneered at Jamal, dismissing him as a little boy, playing lawyer. But Jamal, with a spine of steel, didn't let the insult deter him. He pointed out a legal flaw, a procedural error that Holt had made during the trial. The prosecution had exceeded the allotted time for closing arguments, a detail that was crucial enough to invalidate the verdict. Jamal's voice wavered at first, but as he spoke, his confidence grew. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the sweat pooling at the back of his neck. "The trial was flawed. Your court made a mistake, and that mistake led to my brother's wrongful conviction." The gallery erupted in laughter, a chorus of mockery aimed at the young man standing before the judge. But Jamal didn't back down. He continued, citing Section 32 of the state law, explaining how it gave him the right to appeal and how the case against Darius was built on lies. He stood firm, even as Holt's mocking demeanor turned into anger. The judge's face contorted as he read the motion, and for a brief moment, Jamal saw a flicker of doubt in Holt's eyes. But the fight was far from over. Jamal's appeal was just the beginning, a spark in a fire that had been burning for years. The system didn't take kindly to people like Jamal challenging it. After Jamal's hearing, things escalated quickly. He was followed by the cops, harassed by Judge Holt's allies, and threatened with legal action. The system fought back with all its power, trying to silence Jamal and his fight for justice. But Jamal wouldn't be intimidated. He had seen the cracks in the system, and he was going to exploit them. His fight didn't stop with just the appeal. Jamal continued to gather evidence, uncovering more lies, more corruption, and more cover-ups that had been hidden from the public for years. Every new piece of evidence he uncovered was a step closer to exposing the truth. But with each victory, the danger grew. The system didn't take kindly to people who threatened to tear down the walls they had carefully constructed. Through it all, Jamal's determination never wavered. He fought not just for Darius's freedom, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system built to keep them down. His fight was about more than just one case. It was about breaking the cycle of corruption that had plagued his community for generations. And as Jamal's battle against Judge Holt and the system continued, he knew one thing for sure. The road ahead would be long and hard, but he would never stop fighting for justice, for Darius, for the voiceless, for the truth. Jamal Carter's battle for justice began on a stormy afternoon in a courtroom, where his brother Darius was sentenced to life imprisonment for a crime he didn't commit. The entire trial had been a mockery of justice, a rushed process where the facts were manipulated, the evidence ignored, and the law twisted to serve the needs of a corrupt system. The judge Raymond Holt, a man who had spent years in power, leaned back in his chair with a mocking smirk as the gavel slammed down. Darius's life was now locked away in a cell, all because of the color of his skin and a broken justice system that saw him as guilty before he even had a chance to speak. But Jamal, despite being just a teenager, wasn't about to let that be the end. He stood there in his thrift store suit, sweat beading on his forehead, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for his brother, he was fighting for every black man, every person of color who had ever been crushed by the legal system's unfairness. He was about to wage a war, and he was armed with nothing but the law and his own determination. Jamal had spent years poring over legal books, memorizing case laws, statutes, and codes that no one his age should ever have to study. But it was all for this moment, for the moment when his brother's freedom depended on him. As soon as the trial was over, Jamal went straight home, pulled the case files from the public defender's office that he had secretly taken 2 weeks before, and began to sift through them. The papers were a mess, a disorganized heap of coffee stains and scribbled notes. But for Jamal, it was all clear. He had the evidence. A photograph on Darius's phone showed that he was miles away from the crime scene at the time of the robbery. The robbery witness had lied about seeing Darius pull the trigger. The timestamps didn't match up. Jamal knew the fight wouldn't be easy. He was just a kid, alone in a world that seemed designed to keep him down. The courthouse clerk, Doris, barely looked at him when he slid his appeal across the desk. She sneered, dismissing him immediately. "You can't just waltz in here with that mess. Get a real lawyer or get out." Her words stung, but they only strengthened Jamal's resolve. This wasn't about him being a kid or being poor or being black. This was about a broken system that had locked his brother away unjustly. Jamal wasn't going to let her or anyone stop him. Despite the roadblocks, Jamal pushed forward, submitting the appeal himself. It wasn't long before he found out that his filing had caught the attention of Judge Holt, who called for an emergency hearing. The judge's reaction wasn't one of justice. It was one of rage. Holt wasn't about to let some kid undermine his authority. Jamal stood alone against the system, facing down the very judge who had sent his brother to prison. When Jamal stood in front of Judge Holt, the gallery full of reporters and onlookers, Holt sneered at him. "You sound like a scared little boy playing lawyer. This ain't no school play," he mocked. The words stung, but Jamal stood tall. "I'm filing an appeal for my brother, Darius Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness churning inside him. "The trial was flawed. His counsel didn't challenge false testimony, and I have evidence proving he wasn't at the crime scene." The laughter from the gallery felt like a slap in the face, but Jamal didn't back down. He didn't give in. He was there to fight, not to be intimidated. He pointed to a mistake in the court's transcript, citing a procedural error that made the verdict invalid. He wasn't just some kid, he was someone with the law on his side, and he was going to prove it. The judge, despite his bravado, was visibly shaken as he read Jamal's motion. For a brief moment, Jamal saw the cracks in Holt's armor. Holt had been in power for so long, relying on fear and intimidation to maintain control. But Jamal wasn't afraid. He had nothing to lose. The crowd was silent, holding their breath, as Jamal pressed forward, citing specific legal codes and showing how Holt's decision had been flawed. It was a moment of power for Jamal, a moment that turned the tide in the courtroom. But even as Jamal felt the taste of victory, he knew that the fight was far from over. Holt may have been momentarily thrown off balance, but the system he controlled was vast, and Jamal's journey was just beginning. The next step in his fight was to get his brother a retrial, but as Jamal would soon learn, the system was built to protect the powerful, and it would stop at nothing to keep its secrets buried. As Jamal continued his legal battle, the stakes became higher. The corruption of Judge Holt's court, the systemic racism that permeated the justice system, and the weight of the world on his shoulders all made Jamal's fight a dangerous one. But Jamal had one thing the system didn't expect: the truth. He was a teenager, yes, but he was armed with the law, with the facts, and with the determination to see his brother free. Throughout the process, Jamal had to deal with more than just legal obstacles. The threats and harassment escalated. Holt's allies, including corrupt police officers, began to target Jamal. He was arrested, beaten, and silenced. But even when they tried to break him, Jamal refused to back down. Every punch, every setback only fueled his fight. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let them erase his brother's name from history. The day of the retrial arrived, and Jamal stood in front of the courtroom once again. This time, the fight had become bigger than just Darius's freedom. It had become a fight against the system itself. The corruption, the abuse of power, and the broken promises of justice had all led to this moment. Jamal had brought the case to the world's attention, and now it was time for the truth to come out. The retrial wasn't just about a guilty or innocent verdict. It was about exposing the corrupt network that had kept people like Darius behind bars for years. It was about holding the system accountable for the lives it had destroyed. And Jamal knew that no matter the outcome, his fight was far from over. It wasn't just about freeing his brother. It was about tearing down the walls that had held so many others captive. In the end, the battle was won, but the cost was steep. Darius's freedom came too late. He had been lost to the system for too long. Jamal had broken through the walls of corruption, but in doing so, he had also uncovered the true cost of justice in a broken world. Jamal Carter's story is a testament to the raw power of resilience, the harsh realities of systemic racism, and the relentless fight for justice. It begins with a painful and almost unbearable moment, his brother Darius being sentenced to life for a crime he didn't commit. Judge Holt, a figure of unchecked power in their small southern town, handed down the verdict with a cold smirk, while the jury, an all-white panel, snickered. Darius was sentenced without proper defense, all based on fabricated testimony and racial prejudice. But Jamal, despite his youth, refused to accept the system's decision. He couldn't sit idly by while his brother, his flesh and blood, was locked away for something he didn't do. The fight to free Darius wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was a battle against a corrupt system, a system built to oppress and crush those who dared to stand against it. The first spark of rebellion within Jamal was ignited in that courtroom. While the gavel slammed down and the world seemed to fall apart around him, Jamal's determination only grew stronger. He wasn't just a 16-year-old kid with a passion for law. He was the only person standing between his brother and an unjust sentence. In that moment, he made a vow to himself. He would fight until the very end, no matter the cost. Jamal's method of resistance was not based on violence or hate. Instead, it was grounded in the power of knowledge, of knowing the law inside and out. For years, he had buried himself in law books, reading and memorizing statutes and case laws that most people his age wouldn't have even understood. Jamal had always known that the law could be a weapon, but he never fully realized how much power it held until the day he was forced to use it. Jamal's dedication paid off when he managed to find new evidence, a crucial photograph from Darius's phone that placed him miles away from the scene of the crime at the time it was supposed to have happened. It was a sliver of truth, but that sliver was all Jamal needed. Armed with this, he filed an appeal. But even this simple act of filing paperwork was met with opposition, ridicule, and racial prejudice. At the courthouse, Doris, the clerk, mocked him, dismissing him as a kid and telling him to get a real lawyer. But Jamal, having spent years studying the law, knew his rights. He didn't let Doris's disdain or the systemic barriers that stood in his way stop him. He knew that if he didn't act, his brother would stay locked away forever. Jamal's persistence didn't go unnoticed, and soon his case drew the attention of the very man who had condemned his brother to prison, Judge Holt. The judge, whose face was a permanent mask of disdain and arrogance, summoned Jamal to an emergency hearing. The courtroom was thick with tension as Jamal stood before Holt, the man who had destroyed his brother's life. Holt ridiculed him, mocking his age and his knowledge of the law. But Jamal, despite the sneers and the laughter from the gallery, stood tall. He wasn't just fighting for himself or his brother. He was fighting for every person who had been unjustly imprisoned, for every black person who had faced the weight of a biased system. With unwavering confidence, he pointed to the flaws in the trial's transcript and demanded a retrial. For the first time, Jamal saw Holt, the man who thought he ruled unchallenged, falter. Jamal's courage didn't end there. The pressure on him only grew as he filed motion after motion, each time facing more resistance from the system. But it was Jamal's deep understanding of the law and his unbreakable will that kept him going. He had nothing to lose. His brother's life was on the line, and Jamal knew that if he didn't fight, no one would. As he fought on, he encountered more than just institutional barriers. He was confronted with the harsh reality of how far the system was willing to go to protect its own interests. Even when Jamal submitted evidence that proved his brother's innocence, the courts tried to silence him. It wasn't just the legal system that sought to crush him. It was the physical threat that came from those in power. Jamal found himself targeted, beaten, and humiliated. He was arrested by corrupt police officers who planted drugs on him, hoping to silence his fight. But Jamal's spirit remained unbroken. Every punch, every beating, only fueled his resolve to take down the system that had taken so much from him. He was relentless, using every tool at his disposal to expose the truth. His fight went viral, catching the attention of reporters and citizens alike. People across the country began to rally behind him, demanding justice for Darius and for the countless others who had suffered under the corrupt legal system. Jamal became a symbol of resistance, a black teen using his knowledge and his voice to tear down the walls of injustice that had kept his people oppressed for centuries. As the legal battle raged on, the stakes grew higher. Jamal's life was at constant risk as Judge Holt, emboldened by his power, sought to destroy him at every turn. The system was vast and Holt had friends in high places, making it difficult for Jamal to get any real support. But still, Jamal pushed forward. His determination never wavered, even as he found himself locked away in solitary confinement after being framed for crimes he didn't commit. In prison, he faced daily brutality, but he kept his eyes on the prize, freedom for Darius. It was in these dark moments that Jamal realized the true price of justice. It wasn't just about winning in the courtroom, it was about surviving long enough to get there. Despite the seemingly insurmountable obstacles, Jamal found an unlikely ally in the form of a reporter named Isha. Isha recorded the key evidence and exposed the deep corruption within the system, including Holt's connections to private prisons and his involvement in a broader conspiracy to target black youth. Her efforts, alongside Jamal's tireless work, began to crack the foundation of Holt's empire. When Jamal was freed from solitary confinement, his mission was far from over. He had exposed the system for what it was, a machine built to profit from the oppression of black lives. But now he had to finish what he started. He had to ensure that Holt and his cronies were held accountable for their crimes. In the end, Jamal's fight for justice wasn't just about winning a case, it was about exposing the deep-seated racism that permeated every level of society. It was about showing that one person, no matter how young, no matter how powerless they might seem, can make a difference. Jamal Carter, through his relentless pursuit of justice, proved that even in the face of insurmountable odds, the truth can still prevail. His journey was a harsh reminder of the price of justice and the lengths to which the powerful will go to protect themselves. But it was also a call to action for those who believe in fairness, equality, and the rule of law. Jamal's story is one of hope, defiance, and the belief that no matter how broken the system may be, change is always possible if you're willing to fight for it. Jamal Carter's journey is one that delves deeply into the themes of resilience, the fight for justice, and the consequences of standing up against systemic oppression. It's a story that takes a young man from the brink of despair to the heights of rebellion, all the while showcasing the unyielding power of determination in the face of immense adversity. His battle was not just for his brother's freedom, it was a fight against a corrupt system that had stacked the deck against people who looked like him. What began as a personal mission to exonerate Darius grew into a monumental clash with the deeply entrenched forces of racial injustice, revealing how far those in power would go to protect their interests. The turning point in Jamal's journey came in the courtroom. When his brother Darius was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Jamal, then just 16 years old, found himself thrust into a world that was foreign, yet painfully familiar. The courtroom was not a place of justice for him, but a place where the deck was deliberately stacked against him. The jury, an all-white panel, found it easier to believe the fabricated testimony of a white witness than the truth. It wasn't the first time the justice system had failed black individuals, but this time it was personal. The words that followed the gavel slam, the smirking face of Judge Holt, and the indifferent laughter of the jury would haunt Jamal forever. Yet from this moment of despair, Jamal found something inside himself that no one could take away, a fiery determination to challenge the very system that sought to crush him and his brother. Jamal's response to the injustice was not one of blind rage, but of calculated action. Armed with an incredible memory and a passion for the law, Jamal turned to books, learning every statute and legal precedent he could. While most teenagers were caught up in sports or school dances, Jamal buried himself in law books, determined to learn the rules of the game so he could fight back. This knowledge became his weapon, and it was one that was far stronger than the mockery of the court. He memorized every section, every clause, and every legal trick that might offer him a sliver of hope. His photographic memory and his ability to retain and recall information allowed him to see the flaws in his brother's case. He discovered that the evidence against Darius was based on unreliable testimony, and he found a key piece of evidence, a photo from Darius's phone, showing that Darius wasn't even near the scene of the robbery when it happened. This grainy image was his first victory, a sliver of truth that Jamal knew he had to use to tear the system down. The battle, however, was far from easy. Filing an appeal should have been a simple legal process, but in Jamal's case, it was met with nothing but contempt. The clerk at the courthouse, Doris, looked him up and down and immediately dismissed him. "You can't just waltz in here with that mess. You a lawyer?" she sneered. Jamal's response was calm, steady, and resolute. He wasn't just a kid trying to get attention. He was a brother trying to save his sibling. Armed with his legal knowledge, Jamal stood firm and demanded his right to file the appeal. His heart pounded, but his resolve was even stronger. Jamal refused to be intimidated, even when the racist, patronizing behavior of those in power was meant to break him. He understood the importance of challenging the system and knew that this was just the beginning of his fight. But it was not just the court system that stood in Jamal's way. It was also the police and other agents of the state. After submitting his appeal, Jamal found himself targeted by officers who planted drugs on him, hoping to discredit him and prevent him from continuing his mission. Despite the violence and intimidation, Jamal never wavered. His fight was not just about his brother's freedom. It was about something much larger, exposing the pervasive corruption that existed within every institution that had power over black lives. His courage to speak out against the police brutality he faced, despite the severe consequences, showed his deep understanding of the stakes involved. He could no longer sit back and allow the system to claim more lives. Jamal's fight became increasingly public as the media began to take notice of his determination and his fight against racial injustice. A video of him standing up in court and challenging the system went viral, and people across the country began to rally behind him. He became a symbol of hope for many who had suffered under the same oppressive system. Despite the physical and emotional toll the fight was taking on him, Jamal kept going. The more people who supported his cause, the more fuel it added to his fire. But for every victory, Jamal encountered deeper obstacles. Despite the evidence of Darius's innocence, Judge Holt, along with his cronies, tried to shut down Jamal at every turn. However, as Jamal's public support grew, so did the lengths to which his opponents were willing to go to silence him. The system tried to break Jamal by using physical violence, manipulation, and threats. Yet Jamal's spirit remained unbroken. He knew that his fight for his brother's freedom was part of a much larger battle, one that wasn't just about a courtroom, but about the very soul of the country. Jamal's determination to expose the systemic racism that had kept his brother and countless others imprisoned was the driving force behind every action he took. He didn't just want to free his brother, he wanted to expose the deeply ingrained injustices that had been ignored for so long. Jamal's resilience reached its peak when he managed to gain access to evidence that exposed the corruption running through the judicial and police systems. He uncovered a network of payoffs, corruption, and manipulation that tied Holt to private prisons and a system that profited from keeping black people in prison. It was a shocking revelation that shook the foundations of the justice system, but the system fought back. Judge Holt, realizing his empire was crumbling, began using his power to retaliate. Jamal was arrested, beaten, and tortured in solitary confinement in an attempt to break him. Yet in every moment of pain, Jamal found the strength to keep fighting. His relentless pursuit of justice did not just stop at his own survival. It was about ensuring that the truth came to light. His ultimate goal was not just to get Darius out of prison, but to bring down the corrupt system that had condemned him in the first place. Jamal's courage wasn't just about his actions in the courtroom. It was about his ability to withstand the systemic forces working against him. Even as he suffered unimaginable violence and loss, Jamal's spirit burned brighter than ever. His persistence, his belief in the law, and his refusal to accept the status quo made him an unrelenting force against the powerful system. Through his sacrifice, Jamal reminded us all that the fight for justice often comes at a steep price, and yet it is a fight worth taking. In the end, Jamal's battle was about more than just his brother. It was about his survival in a world that constantly sought to suppress him and others like him. His determination to confront the system and demand accountability, despite the enormous risks, left an indelible mark on the world. His journey teaches us that real change is born from resilience and from the courage to stand against forces much larger than ourselves. Jamal Carter's story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, there is light in those who fight for what is right. Jamal Carter's journey is a poignant reflection of the challenges that arise when one decides to fight against an unjust system. It is a story that is deeply entrenched in the struggles of race, the flaws in the judicial system, and the sacrifices that come with standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. His unwavering determination to exonerate his brother Darius and the lengths he went to in order to expose the corruption within the system illustrate the power of resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. At the core of Jamal's story is his fight to secure justice for his wrongfully convicted brother. Darius was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he did not commit, and Jamal, a 16-year-old with an exceptional photographic memory, took it upon himself to challenge the system. His decision to take matters into his own hands wasn't born out of impulsiveness, but rather from a deep understanding that the justice system had failed his brother and would continue to fail him unless someone took action. The courtroom, which was meant to be a place of justice, was instead a place where Jamal and his brother were made to feel powerless. The biased, all-white jury and the contemptuous Judge Holt were symbols of a larger issue: the systemic racism that permeated every aspect of the legal process. The smirking faces in the courtroom were a reminder that, for people like Jamal, justice was a distant ideal, often obstructed by power and prejudice. Despite being dismissed by the justice system, Jamal refused to be silenced. He understood the power of knowledge and began to equip himself with the tools needed to challenge the system. For most teenagers, the typical pursuit would be sports, school, or socializing. But for Jamal, it was law books. With a determination that bordered on obsession, he immersed himself in legal codes, statutes, and case laws. His uncanny ability to memorize these complex materials gave him the upper hand when he needed it most. Armed with his newfound knowledge, Jamal found discrepancies in the case against Darius, revealing false testimony and contradictions in the evidence. He discovered that the timeline of the robbery, as claimed by the prosecution, didn't match the evidence. Darius, according to Jamal's findings, was miles away from the crime scene at the time it occurred, supported by a grainy photo from his brother's phone. This discovery gave Jamal the first breakthrough in a long and difficult journey, and it became the spark that ignited his fight for justice. However, Jamal's path to exonerating his brother was fraught with resistance. When he attempted to file the appeal, he was met with ridicule and scorn by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. Doris, the clerk at the courthouse, mocked him and refused to accept the paperwork simply because of his appearance and his age. Jamal, however, did not back down. His knowledge of the law allowed him to argue his right to file the appeal under state law. Even though the system tried to push him out, Jamal's perseverance kept him standing tall. He knew that he was not just fighting for his brother's freedom, but against a corrupt system that saw people like him as expendable. His experience at the courthouse was a reminder of how deeply embedded racism and prejudice are within institutions of power. The dismissive attitudes and outright hostility he encountered were evidence of a system rigged to protect those in power while denying justice to those who needed it most. Despite the setbacks, Jamal's resolve only grew stronger. His fight intensified when he was falsely accused and framed by corrupt police officers who planted drugs on him. This was an attempt to intimidate him into silence. But Jamal's spirit was unyielding. He knew that this was a game of survival, and he could not afford to let them break him. His experiences with the police, the planted evidence, and the continuous threats made it clear that the fight wasn't just about freeing Darius, it was about exposing the broken system for what it was. Every battle Jamal faced, from the courtroom to the streets, only fueled his desire to fight harder for the truth. Jamal's journey also highlighted how the media and public opinion can be powerful tools in the fight for justice. As Jamal's story began to spread, he became a symbol of resistance. His court appearances and his determination to fight for his brother's innocence garnered widespread attention. Jamal's story resonated with people across the country, especially those who had faced similar challenges within the system. His voice was amplified by those who believed in his cause, and the media attention he received became an important catalyst for change. However, as Jamal's public profile grew, so did the dangers he faced. Judge Holt, realizing that Jamal was threatening his power, began to retaliate with increasing force. Holt's actions were not just those of a judge trying to protect his authority, but of a man who was willing to go to any lengths to maintain the status quo. Despite the physical and emotional toll, Jamal continued his fight with unrelenting determination. He uncovered critical evidence that revealed the depth of corruption within the system. He discovered a network of payoffs, manipulation, and racism that tied Judge Holt to private prisons and the perpetuation of an unjust legal system. This discovery, while shocking, also provided Jamal with the ammunition he needed to take down the system that had wrongfully imprisoned his brother and countless others. However, as Jamal exposed the truth, he became more of a target. The very system he was fighting against was now hunting him. Jamal's fight was not without its losses. His family's home was burned down in an act of retaliation, and his brother Darius, who had been his primary motivation, was brutally murdered in prison. The pain of losing his brother, coupled with the weight of his failed attempts to save him, threatened to break Jamal's spirit. Yet through all the grief, Jamal never gave up. His mission to expose the corruption and injustice within the system took on even greater urgency. The fight for Darius's life became a fight for justice, not only for his brother, but for all those who had been wronged by the system. The ultimate message of Jamal's journey is that justice is not easily attained, and the fight for it requires more than just legal knowledge. It requires sacrifice, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit. Jamal's determination to stand up against the system, even in the face of unimaginable adversity, teaches us that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most difficult struggles. His story is a testament to the power of one individual's resolve to challenge a corrupt system, and it serves as a reminder that true justice is often a long, painful battle, but it is a battle worth fighting. Jamal Carter's fight for justice and the subsequent revelations about the corruption in the judicial system highlight the resilience, strength, and determination required to battle against powerful systems that are rigged to oppress. His story serves as a microcosm of the struggles faced by countless individuals who find themselves pitted against an unjust system that operates in favor of those in power. This fight is not just about one person seeking justice for their family. It is about confronting a much larger system of inequality, corruption, and racism that impacts every aspect of their lives. At the heart of Jamal's battle is the wrongful conviction of his brother Darius, who was sentenced to life for a crime he did not commit. The catalyst for Jamal's journey was the realization that the justice system, which is supposed to offer fairness and equity, had failed his brother. The trial was biased and unjust, with an all-white jury and a judge who appeared to have no interest in delivering a fair verdict. The racial prejudice embedded in the legal system was evident from the beginning, and Jamal, though just a 16-year-old high school student, understood that the odds were stacked against them. Instead of accepting the fate that the system had dealt them, Jamal decided to take matters into his own hands. What made Jamal's fight so extraordinary was his ability to leverage the law itself as a weapon. While most teenagers might be concerned with fitting in or finding their place in the world, Jamal focused his energy on mastering the intricacies of the law. He knew that he was not going to win this battle with brute force or by playing the system's game. Instead, he relied on his intelligence, his photographic memory, and his understanding of legal statutes to build a case for his brother's innocence. While other teens might have spent their days playing sports or hanging out with friends, Jamal buried himself in legal textbooks, learning everything he could to expose the flaws in the case against his brother. His tireless study and knowledge of the law became his greatest asset. He discovered inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, including a crucial piece of evidence that placed Darius miles away from the crime scene when the robbery took place. Armed with this new evidence, Jamal worked tirelessly to file an appeal for his brother's retrial. However, this was where the real challenges began. Despite his knowledge and his valid legal claims, Jamal faced continuous resistance from the legal system. His appeal was rejected by court clerks, who dismissed him because of his youth and appearance, and even mocked him for trying to challenge the system without a lawyer. These moments of humiliation did not deter Jamal, however. He knew that the only way to break through the barriers was to persist. Every time the system tried to knock him down, Jamal found a way to stand back up. He did not back down from the insults or the prejudices he faced. When a court clerk, Doris, refused to accept his appeal and mocked him for not having a lawyer, Jamal stood his ground, citing his legal rights and quoting specific legal codes to demand that his appeal be filed. Despite the constant rejection, Jamal's resilience only grew stronger. He realized that he was not just fighting for his brother, he was fighting for something larger, a battle against a corrupt system that systematically undermines the rights of marginalized communities. What made Jamal's fight even more difficult was the growing danger he faced. As his case began to attract more attention, the judicial system retaliated in ways that were meant to intimidate him into silence. He was framed by the police with drugs planted on him in an attempt to discredit him and sabotage his efforts. The officers who harassed him and planted evidence on him were acting under the influence of Judge Holt, who had become increasingly aware of Jamal's relentless pursuit of justice. These tactics were not just meant to suppress Jamal, they were meant to send a message to anyone who dared to challenge the system. The message was clear. Justice was not meant for people like Jamal. It was a harsh reminder that, despite all of Jamal's legal knowledge and tenacity, the system he was fighting against would stop at nothing to maintain its power and control. Jamal's persistence, however, paid off. His knowledge of the law and his refusal to back down earned him the respect of some key individuals, including a reporter named Aisha, who began to help him spread his story. Aisha's video, which captured the corrupt actions of Judge Holt and his cronies, went viral, and Jamal became a symbol of defiance against the injustice of the system. The media exposure, however, only escalated the danger Jamal faced. Judge Holt, realizing that Jamal was exposing his empire, began to retaliate more aggressively. This time, his retaliation was not just legal, it was personal. Jamal's home was destroyed in an arson attack, and his brother Darius was murdered in prison as a final act of vengeance. The murder of Darius was a crushing blow to Jamal. It represented the ultimate sacrifice in his fight for justice, and it shook him to his core. His brother, whom he had been fighting for, was now gone. But Jamal's resolve did not break. Instead, the loss of his brother fueled his fight even more. The loss of Darius turned his quest for justice into something much larger. It became a fight not only for his brother's freedom, but for the freedom and dignity of all those who had been wronged by the system. His brother's death represented the price of defiance in a world where people of color are systematically oppressed and silenced. Jamal's fight also revealed the systemic nature of the corruption he was up against. Through his research and persistence, Jamal uncovered the vast network of corruption that Judge Holt had built over the years. Holt was not just an isolated bad actor. He was part of a larger system that exploited marginalized communities for financial gain. This system included private prisons, corrupt law enforcement officers, and politicians who profited from the mass incarceration of Black people. Jamal's revelations exposed the extent to which the justice system was broken. He didn't just fight for his brother, He fought to expose a network of systemic oppression that had been operating in the shadows for decades. Jamal's victory, however, was not a simple one. Although he was able to expose Judge Holt's corruption and free his brother, the cost was immense. Jamal's journey illustrates that in the fight for justice, one must be prepared to pay a heavy price. Jamal lost his brother, his home, and his innocence. But he also gained something invaluable, a deeper understanding of the system he was fighting against, the resilience to keep going despite overwhelming odds, and the knowledge that sometimes the only way to change the world is to fight against it, no matter how painful or difficult that fight may be. Ultimately, Jamal's story is a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the necessity of challenging unjust systems of power. His journey shows that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, one person can make a difference. But it also serves as a warning about the cost of justice. While Jamal won many battles, the ultimate price was the loss of his brother. The fight for justice is never easy, and the system will fight back. But Jamal's story proves that the fight is worth it, no matter the cost. Jamal Carter's story is one of perseverance and resilience in the face of systemic injustice, showing the power of one person's determination to challenge an oppressive system. His fight for his brother, Darius, who was wrongfully convicted, highlights the brutal reality of a legal system that is biased against marginalized communities, particularly Black individuals. Jamal's relentless pursuit of justice serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up to power, no matter how overwhelming the odds may seem. At the heart of Jamal's battle is his belief in the law as a tool for justice. While many of his peers might have focused on other things, Jamal spent his teenage years studying legal codes, memorizing case law, and preparing himself to fight a battle that most adults would have considered impossible. He knew that the only way to overturn the injustice that had befallen his brother was through knowledge and determination. The legal system, which should have been a source of protection and fairness, was instead a weapon used to imprison his brother based on racial prejudice. The moment Jamal entered the courtroom and saw his brother sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, the spark of his fight was ignited. He knew that his only option was to challenge the system that had failed him and his brother. What made Jamal's journey even more difficult was the overt racism he faced at every step. From the all-white jury to the mocking words of the judge, Jamal was constantly reminded that the system was designed to crush people like him. Despite the odds, Jamal remained steadfast in his belief that the law could be a weapon for justice, and he was willing to risk everything to prove it. Jamal's ability to fight the system was rooted in his knowledge of the law, but he also learned the hard way that knowledge alone was not enough. As he navigated the bureaucracy and faced constant resistance, he realized that his fight would not only be about proving his brother's innocence, but also about exposing the deeper, more corrupt structures within the judicial system. The way the court clerks treated him, dismissing his appeal simply because he was a young Black teenager, was just the tip of the iceberg. Jamal began to understand that the fight for justice was not just about one case. It was about dismantling the system that allowed such miscarriages of justice to occur. As Jamal's story progressed, he uncovered the vast corruption within the system. His efforts to get Darius's case retried were met with resistance at every turn, not just from the court system, but also from law enforcement, who went so far as to frame him by planting drugs on him. Jamal's knowledge of the law, however, kept him grounded. He fought back, using every legal avenue available to him, even when the system seemed to push back harder. His resilience in the face of these attacks showed the world that one person, armed with the truth and the law, could take on a corrupt system. Despite the immense personal cost, including the death of his brother and the destruction of his home, Jamal's commitment to seeking justice never wavered. His story ultimately serves as a powerful call to action, urging others to stand up against systemic injustice. Jamal Carter's fight demonstrates that no matter how powerful the forces working against you are, the fight for justice is always worth it. His story is a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of fighting for what is right, even when the system is designed to make you fail.